Melania Trump denied entry to her own jet. What they were hiding will shock you. The evening sun cast a golden glow across the tarmac at West Palm Beach Airport, illuminating the pristine white jet that awaited its next departure. For Melania Trump, it was supposed to be another seamless flight. She approached the aircraft with her usual composed demeanor, her tailored cream pantsuit and silk scarf fluttering slightly in the breeze. Her security detail walked several paces behind, keeping their distance, a subtle acknowledgement of her preference for quiet moments before boarding. As she neared the stairs leading to the plane, Melania noticed an unusual tension among the crew. The ground staff avoided eye contact, their movements hurried and uncoordinated. Something was off. Still, she continued forward, her sharp instincts already on alert. At the base of the staircase stood Paul Brennan, the pilot, a man she'd flown with countless times. Paul was a familiar presence, reliable, professional, unflappable. But today, his demeanor was anything but reassuring. His usually confident stance was replaced by a rigid posture, his hazel eyes darting nervously toward the black SUV parked a short distance away. "Good evening, Mrs. Trump," Paul greeted her, his voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. "Evening, Paul," Melania replied, her tone polite yet clipped. "Are we ready for takeoff?" Paul hesitated, glancing down at the tablet in his hand. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I can't let you board." The words hung in the air like a sudden gust of wind, unexpected and jarring. Melania's steps faltered, but her composure didn't break. She tilted her head slightly, her piercing blue eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, I've received orders," Paul continued, his voice quieter now, as though afraid of being overheard. "You're not cleared to board this flight." Melania's jaw tightened, though her expression remained calm. "Orders from whom?" Paul shifted uncomfortably, his gaze now fixed on a spot just over her shoulder. "Ma'am, I don't have all the details. It's classified." Classified. The single word carried a weight that made Paul flinch. Melania took a step closer, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "This is my plane, my flight. You will tell me who gave these orders and why." Paul raised a hand, palm out, as if to physically prevent her from moving forward. It was a bold move, one that spoke less of defiance and more of desperation. "Mrs. Trump, please, this isn't about you. It's for your safety." "Safety," Melania repeated, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm. Her eyes flicked to the black SUV, its windows impenetrably dark. "And whose idea of safety involves keeping me off my own aircraft?" Behind them, the crew stood frozen, their eyes darting between Melania and Paul like spectators unsure of which side to root for. The tension was palpable, the kind that made every small sound, every distant hum of an engine, every faint whisper of the wind feel magnified. "I need answers, Paul," Melania demanded, her tone sharp enough to slice through the heavy air. "And I need them now." Paul hesitated, his internal conflict written all over his face. His hand still blocked her path, but his resolve was wavering. "Ma'am, I'm just following orders," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Melania's piercing gaze locked onto his, unrelenting. "Then you'd better tell me where those orders came from, because this doesn't end here." Paul's silence spoke volumes, and in that moment, Melania knew this was no ordinary delay. Something far bigger was at play, and she was determined to uncover it. Melania Trump's heels clicked sharply against the tarmac as she stepped back from Paul Brennan, taking a moment to absorb the absurdity of what she'd just heard. Denied boarding her own jet with no real explanation, it was unthinkable. Yet here she was, staring down a man who had always been a picture of professionalism but now seemed like a bundle of nerves caught in a web of secrecy. "Paul," she said, her tone colder now, "you're making a grave mistake. If this is some kind of misunderstanding, I suggest you resolve it immediately." Paul looked down, as if hoping the ground might swallow him whole. "Mrs. Trump, please understand. This isn't personal. I've been given direct orders, and I can't go against them." Melania's patience was wearing thin. Direct orders from whom? My staff? The airline? Someone had better explain why I'm being treated like a stranger at my own jet. Paul swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I can't disclose that, ma'am. I'm only doing my job. Melania took a step closer, her presence commanding despite her smaller frame. Your job is to fly this plane, Paul. So either you start doing it or I'll make sure this is your last assignment. Paul flinched, but he held his ground, his hands still raised slightly, physically blocking her path. Mrs. Trump, I can't let you board. The tension between them was almost unbearable, and the crew behind them watched with bated breath. Melania's sharp gaze swept over the scene, catching sight of the black SUV parked nearby. It hadn't been there when she arrived, and now it loomed like a silent specter, its tinted windows hiding whatever or whoever was inside. The sight made her stomach tighten. Something wasn't right. Then she noticed something else. Two men in dark suits stood near the nose of the jet, engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation. Their gestures were sharp, their voices too low to carry across the tarmac. They weren't part of her usual crew. She'd never seen them before. Who were they, and why were they here? Paul, she said again, her voice cutting through the heavy air. If you think I'm going to walk away from this without answers, you don't know me very well. Paul glanced nervously toward the men in suits, then back at Melania. Ma'am, I can't say anything more. Please just go back to the terminal. This is for your own safety. My safety. Melania's voice was sharp now, her disbelief evident. You think denying me access to my plane and hiding behind vague excuses is keeping me safe? You're lying to me, Paul, and I don't take kindly to liars. Paul's face reddened, his internal struggle visible to anyone watching. He lowered his voice, leaning in slightly. Mrs. Trump, I swear to you I don't want to do this, but there's more going on here than you realize. I'm following orders because I don't have a choice. There's always a choice, Melania shot back, and you're making the wrong one. Before Paul could respond, one of the suited men broke away from his conversation and walked briskly toward them. His expression was grim, his presence imposing. Captain Brennan, he said, his voice clipped and authoritative. We need a word. Now. Paul hesitated, glancing at Melania before reluctantly stepping away. The man in the suit, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark glasses that obscured his eyes, gestured for Paul to follow him a few paces away. Their conversation was hushed, but Melania caught snippets. Words like classified and protocol that only heightened her suspicions. Her phone buzzed in her hand, a call from her assistant. She answered quickly, her tone brisk. I'm being denied access to my jet. Find out who authorized this and get back to me immediately. As she hung up, her gaze returned to Paul and the suited man. Paul looked increasingly uncomfortable, his shoulders stiff, his head nodding slightly in what seemed like reluctant agreement. When the man finally walked away, Paul returned, his face pale and his movements robotic. Mrs. Trump, he said, his voice quieter than before. Please, I'm asking you one last time. Go back to the terminal. I can't let you on this flight. Melania's expression was ice. And I'm telling you one last time, Paul. I'm not leaving without an explanation. Paul opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His hesitation spoke volumes, and Melania knew she had him cornered. Whatever he wasn't saying, whatever orders he was following, it was clear this situation wasn't just about protocol. It was personal, and she wasn't about to back down. Paul Brennan felt his chest tighten as he stood frozen in front of Melania Trump. He had flown countless VIPs over his 2 decades as a pilot, but this was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The weight of his orders, the looming presence of the suited agents, and the intensity of Melania's piercing gaze. It all bore down on him like a storm he couldn't escape. Paul had always prided himself on being professional, but now he found himself questioning everything. The orders he'd received that morning had been vague but direct. Ground the flight. Deny passenger 1 access under all circumstances. Do not disclose the reason. Comply with further instructions from agents on site. The email had come from an unfamiliar address, but the directives were backed by official-sounding language and a promise of severe consequences for disobedience. When he'd called the airline for clarification, he'd been redirected to a government contact who confirmed the instructions. What troubled him most, though, wasn't the secrecy. It was the tone. There had been no mention of technical issues, no explanation about potential threats, just a chilling warning. For her safety, keep her off the plane. Paul's mind raced as he looked at Melania, standing firm on the tarmac with the authority of someone who'd spent years navigating powerful, high-stakes environments. She wasn't just angry. She was suspicious, and that suspicion was a ticking time bomb. He hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of the clipboard he carried, as if the papers it held could offer some kind of reassurance. They didn't. "Mrs. Trump," he said carefully, "you're not just a passenger. Your safety is paramount, and that's why these measures are in place. I can't say more, but I need you to trust that this is for the best." Melania's eyes narrowed. "You keep saying this is for my safety, but you can't give me one concrete reason why. Do you even know why you're doing this? Or are you just following orders like a robot?" Paul flinched. Her words cut deep, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. He didn't know why. He didn't know who had issued the orders or what they were protecting her from. All he knew was that his career, his reputation, and perhaps even his freedom were on the line if he disobeyed. He glanced toward the black SUV again. The men inside hadn't moved, but their presence loomed over him like a shadow. He thought about his family, his wife, his 2 kids, and the life he'd built through years of hard work. Was he willing to risk all of that? Paul's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his name. One of the agents, Agent Graham, approached with quick, deliberate steps. "Captain Brennan," Graham said, his tone sharp and commanding. "A word." Paul nodded, then turned back to Melania. "Please, ma'am, wait here." Melania crossed her arms but didn't argue, her sharp gaze following Paul as he walked a few paces away with Graham. "Captain," Graham began in a low voice, "you're doing fine. Stick to the plan. Keep her off the plane and out of the loop. This isn't a negotiation." Paul's jaw tightened. "I understand that, but I don't feel like I've been given enough information to handle this properly. She's asking questions I can't answer, and it's only escalating." "That's not your concern," Graham replied. "Your job is to follow orders, not question them. The less you know, the safer you are." "Got it." Paul didn't respond immediately. He glanced back at Melania, standing near the stairs with a calm but determined expression, then at the black SUV. The words, "the less you know, the safer you are," echoed in his mind. "What exactly is on that plane?" Paul finally asked. Graham's face darkened. "You don't want to know, Captain. Trust me on that. Just do your job." As Graham walked away, Paul stood in silence, his thoughts swirling. He looked back at Melania, who hadn't moved. Her patience was clearly wearing thin, but her resolve was stronger than ever. Paul knew he was running out of time to make a choice. He could either keep following orders and live with the guilt of never knowing the truth, or he could take a stand and risk everything. Paul Brennan returned to the base of the stairs with the weight of Graham's words pressing on his shoulders. He looked at Melania Trump, who was now pacing slightly, her frustration barely concealed behind her composed exterior. Every instinct he had screamed that the situation was far more dangerous than anyone was letting on. He just didn't know how far it went, or how much danger they were really in. Melania stopped pacing when she saw Paul approach. Her eyes narrowed. "Well, are you ready to explain what's really going on? Or am I supposed to keep playing this guessing game?" Paul hesitated, his gaze flicking to the jet, then to the black SUV still parked ominously in the distance. He was torn, caught between the orders he'd been given and the growing realization that something was deeply wrong. "Mrs. Trump," he began carefully, "I've done everything by the book my entire career, but right now, I'm not sure if following orders is the right thing to do." Her expression softened just slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Then do the right thing, Paul. Tell me what you know." Before Paul could respond, a low hum emanated from the direction of the plane. Melania and Paul turned simultaneously, their attention drawn to the cockpit. The plane's auxiliary power unit had been engaged, and the faint vibration in the air was unmistakable. Someone was preparing the jet for departure. Paul's stomach sank. "Who's in the cockpit?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Melania didn't wait for him to answer. She moved toward the stairs, her stride purposeful, but Paul stepped in front of her again, blocking her path. "Mrs. Trump, wait." "For what?" she shot back, her voice rising slightly. "Someone's about to take off in my plane, and I'm supposed to stand here and let it happen?" Paul's hands clenched at his sides. "Let me check first. If this is what I think it is." He trailed off, his mind racing. Melania didn't move, but her eyes bore into him. "You have 5 minutes, Paul. Then I'm going up there myself." Paul nodded quickly and hurried up the stairs, his shoes thudding against the metal steps. When he reached the cockpit, he found the door locked. He knocked sharply, his voice firm. "This is Captain Brennan. Open the door." For a moment there was silence. Then the door cracked open just enough for Paul to see a man's face. A face he didn't recognize. The man, disheveled and pale, glanced at Paul with wide, frantic eyes before quickly shutting the door again. Paul's heart raced. Whoever this man was, he wasn't part of the crew. He knocked again, harder this time. "Open the door now, or I'll override it." Inside, he heard the man speaking hurriedly, but the words were muffled. Paul didn't wait for an invitation. He reached for the emergency override panel, inputting the code that would grant him access. The door clicked open, and Paul stepped inside. What he saw made him freeze. In the cockpit, the man from earlier sat in the co-pilot seat, his hands trembling as he clutched a tablet displaying encrypted messages. Behind him, strapped to the floor, was a large, unmarked crate. It was secured with reinforced locks, its surface bearing no labels or markings, except a faint emblem that Paul recognized immediately. The seal of a major government agency. The man in the co-pilot seat turned to Paul, his voice shaking. I didn't have a choice. They told me I'd be safe if I just did what they said." Paul stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "Who are you? And what's in the crate?" The man shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "I can't. They'll kill me if I talk." "You're already here," Paul said, his tone softening. "Whatever's happening, it's already out of your hands. But if you tell me what's going on, I can help." The man hesitated, then glanced at the crate. "It's not just cargo," he whispered. "It's evidence, files, recordings, everything they don't want the public to see." Paul's breath caught. "Evidence of what? Crimes?" The man replied, his voice barely audible. "Powerful people. Corruption. They're using this flight to move it somewhere no one can find it." Paul's mind reeled as the implications sank in. This wasn't about safety or protocol. It was about burying the truth. He turned to the man. "And you? Why are you here?" "I'm the one who leaked it," the man admitted, his voice breaking. "They caught me, but they need me alive to decode the files. If I don't go with them, the crate is useless." Paul felt a chill run through him. He looked back at the crate, then at the man. "We're not letting this plane take off," he said firmly. "Stay here." He hurried back down the stairs to where Melania awaited. Her arms were crossed, her expression tense. "What's on that plane?" she demanded. Paul didn't mince words. "Evidence. Enough to ruin some very powerful people. And a man who says they'll kill him if he doesn't comply." Melania's face darkened. "They're using my plane to cover up a crime?" "Yes," Paul said. "And we need to stop them before they succeed." The pieces of the puzzle had finally fallen into place, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. But the question remained: how far were they willing to go to ensure the truth came out? The air around the jet felt charged, as if the tension of the situation had a physical weight. Paul Brennan stood at the bottom of the stairs, his mind racing. The revelation of what was on the plane, the crate filled with evidence and the terrified man forced to transport it, was more than he could process. Yet there was no time to hesitate. Every second the plane remained operational was a second closer to the truth being erased. Melania Trump's voice cut through his thoughts like a knife. "What do we do now, Paul?" Her calm yet commanding tone made it clear that she wasn't asking for his opinion. She was demanding a solution. Paul looked back toward the plane, then to the black SUV parked nearby. The agents inside were watching closely now, their silhouettes barely visible through the tinted windows. His gut told him they weren't just there to monitor. They were there to ensure this operation went off without a hitch. And if that meant silencing anyone who got in their way, Paul had no doubt they'd do it. "We need to ground this plane permanently," Paul said, his voice low but firm. "If it takes off, the evidence and that man are as good as gone." Melania nodded, her expression hardening with determination. "Then let's ground it." But before they could act, the sound of car doors slamming drew their attention. Two men in dark suits stepped out of the SUV, their movements brisk and purposeful. Agent Wallace, the older of the two, led the way, his face a mask of barely concealed irritation. His younger counterpart, Agent Graham, followed closely, his posture tense and alert. "Mrs. Trump," Wallace called out, his voice carrying an air of forced politeness. "I'm going to have to insist that you leave the premises immediately. This situation is under federal jurisdiction, and your presence here is complicating matters." Melania turned to face him, her chin held high. "Complicating matters? This is my plane, and I have every right to know what's happening on it." "Your right to know doesn't outweigh national security," Wallace snapped. "Please step back, or I'll have no choice but to escort you off the premises." Paul stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with defiance. "You're not being honest, Wallace. There's no security threat here, is there? This is about hiding something. Something you don't want anyone to find." Wallace's eyes narrowed. "You're out of line, Captain, and you're out of excuses." Paul shot back. "I've seen what's in the cockpit. I know about the evidence and the man you've got locked in there." Graham stiffened at the mention of the man in the cockpit, but Wallace's expression remained stone cold. "You've overstepped your bounds, Captain Brennan. This is no longer your concern. It became my concern the moment you used my plane to transport something illegal," Paul countered. "And I'm not letting this flight take off." Wallace's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Paul thought he might lash out. But instead, the agent turned to Melania. "Mrs. Trump, I strongly advise you to reconsider your actions. There are forces at play here that you can't begin to understand." Melania didn't flinch. "What I understand is that you're hiding behind vague threats and secrecy to cover up something you don't want the public to see. And I won't stand for it." Wallace took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You're making a mistake. If this plane doesn't leave, there will be consequences. For you, for him," he gestured toward Paul. "For everyone." Melania's eyes burned with determination. "The only mistake here is thinking I can be intimidated." As the standoff continued, Paul's mind worked furiously. He needed to act fast before Wallace or Graham made their move. His eyes darted to the plane, then back to the agents. "Melania," he said quietly, "we can stop this." "How?" she asked, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Paul leaned in slightly. "The fuel line. If I disable it, the plane won't be able to take off." Melania considered this for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Do it." Paul moved quickly, heading toward the fuel truck parked a short distance away. He grabbed a wrench from the toolkit on the truck and crouched by the jet's fuel intake, working with practiced precision. Wallace and Graham shouted in protest, but Melania stepped between them and the plane, her presence alone enough to keep them at bay. "You're making a big mistake," Wallace barked, his voice rising in frustration. "Do you even know what you're dealing with?" Melania's calm voice cut through his shouting. "No, but I know enough to see through your lies, and I'll make sure the truth comes out." Within moments, Paul finished his work. He stood and stepped back, his hands covered in grease but his expression resolute. "It's done. This plane isn't going anywhere." Wallace's face darkened with fury, but before he could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Police cars and additional SUVs pulled onto the tarmac, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the scene. Melania turned to Wallace, a faint smile playing at her lips. "Looks like we'll have an audience for the truth after all." Paul exhaled deeply, his heart pounding. The plane was grounded, but the battle was far from over. The evidence, the frightened man in the cockpit, the agents determined to keep their secrets. All of it pointed to a much larger fight ahead. And now, with the truth finally beginning to surface, Paul and Melania knew they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But neither of them was willing to back down. The cacophony of sirens grew louder as more vehicles arrived on the tarmac, their flashing lights casting long, flickering shadows across the jet and surrounding area. Melania Trump stood firm, her back straight, her expression a picture of calm defiance. She had spent years in the public eye, navigating power struggles and intense scrutiny. But this moment was different. This wasn't about politics or appearances, it was about something far bigger. Paul Brennan stood beside her, his hands smeared with grease from disabling the jet's fuel line, his breathing heavy. He had made his decision, one that would almost certainly cost him his career. But as he glanced at Melania, he realized he wasn't standing alone. Her resolve was unshakable, her presence a force that seemed to hold back the agents and their threats. Agent Wallace, visibly seething, stepped forward again, his voice barely controlled. "Mrs. Trump, you've interfered with a federal operation. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Melania turned to him, her blue eyes sharp and unyielding. "What I've done is stop you from abusing your authority. You used my plane to transport evidence and a prisoner, all while lying to me about why I was being kept off. The only question left is why." Wallace's composure faltered for a split second before he recovered. "You're out of your depth, Mrs. Trump. This is about national security. Your interference jeopardizes lives. Don't insult my intelligence." She shot back, her tone cold. "You're not protecting lives. You're protecting secrets. Secrets that could destroy powerful people. And you thought you could use me as a pawn to cover it all up." Paul couldn't help but admire her boldness. She was standing toe-to-toe with men who held the weight of the government behind them. Yet she didn't waver. If anything, her defiance only seemed to grow stronger. From the corner of her eye, Melania noticed the black SUV parked nearby. The driver's door opened, and another man stepped out, his face partially obscured by the glare of the flashing lights. He was tall, with a stern expression and the same air of authority as Wallace and Graham. His presence immediately heightened the tension. "Who's that?" Melania asked, her voice steady. Paul followed her gaze. "Another agent, probably, or worse." The man approached with measured steps, his gaze fixed on Melania. When he spoke, his tone was calm but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of menace. "Mrs. Trump, I'm Special Agent Costello. I've been briefed on the situation, and I'm here to ensure it doesn't escalate further." Melania raised an eyebrow. "It already has, Agent Costello. Your operation has been exposed. The police are here. This plane isn't leaving. What exactly do you think you can do now?" Costello's lips curved into a thin smile. "You've created a spectacle, Mrs. Trump, but you've also put yourself in a precarious position. What you've done here will have consequences. Not just for you, but for everyone involved." "That sounds like a threat," Melania replied, unfazed. "It's a fact," Costello said. "You think you've stopped something by grounding this plane, but you've only delayed the inevitable. The evidence will still disappear. The man in the cockpit will be dealt with, and you'll find yourself answering questions you don't want to answer." Melania stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "If you think I'm afraid of you, you're mistaken. I've faced bigger threats than you, and I've come out stronger every time. So go ahead, do your worst. But know this, the truth always comes out. Always." Paul watched the exchange, feeling a mixture of awe and anxiety. He knew they were standing on dangerous ground, but he also knew Melania was right. The truth had a way of finding its way into the light, no matter how hard people tried to bury it. Behind them, The sound of car doors opening signaled the arrival of the police. Uniformed officers approached cautiously, their hands resting on their belts. The lead officer, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. "What's going on here?" she asked, her eyes darting between Melania, Paul, and the agents. Wallace stepped in quickly, his tone clipped. "This is a federal matter. We have everything under control." The officer raised an eyebrow. "That's not what it looks like. We received a call about suspicious activity involving this jet. Care to explain?" Before Wallace could respond, Melania spoke up. "Officer, this plane was being used to transport evidence and a prisoner without proper authorization. These men are trying to cover it up, and when I confronted them, they threatened me." Wallace's face darkened. "She's exaggerating. This is a classified operation, and her interference is jeopardizing its success." The officer turned to Melania, clearly weighing her words. "Is that true, ma'am? Did they threaten you?" Melania nodded, her expression unflinching. "They made it clear that there would be consequences if I didn't back down. But I won't. The evidence on that plane is too important to ignore." The officer looked at Paul. "And you?" Paul hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "She's telling the truth. I saw the evidence myself. They were planning to take off before anyone could stop them." The officer's expression hardened. She turned to her team. "Secure the plane. No one boards or leaves until we get a full explanation." Wallace and Costello exchanged a tense glance but said nothing. The game had shifted, and they were no longer in control. As the officers moved to surround the jet, Melania stepped back, her composure unbroken. She turned to Paul. "You did the right thing." Paul let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "So did you." The wheels of justice had been set in motion, but Melania and Paul both knew this was just the beginning. The truth was finally coming to light, but the fight to protect it was far from over. The tarmac was now a flurry of activity. Police officers secured the area around the jet, their radios crackling with updates as they coordinated efforts to ensure no one left without answering questions. The flashing lights of their vehicles cast eerie patterns on the jet's sleek surface, making the scene feel like a chaotic chessboard with the pieces finally moving into place. Melania Trump stood at the center of it all, her presence commanding attention. She glanced at the agents, who were now huddled together, whispering furiously. Their air of authority had shifted into something else. Unease, maybe even fear. They had lost control of the narrative, and Melania intended to make sure it stayed that way. Paul Brennan stood beside her, his nerves still frayed but his resolve stronger than ever. He had taken the biggest gamble of his life by going against protocol, but as he looked at the grounded jet, he knew he'd made the right choice. "Mrs. Trump," he said quietly, "I don't think we've seen the full scope of what's going on here." Melania nodded, her gaze never leaving the agents. "This isn't just about that evidence. It's about who they're protecting, and how far they're willing to go to keep their secrets." Paul followed her gaze, his mind racing. The crate he had seen in the cockpit wasn't just filled with evidence. It was a threat to powerful people, the kind who operated in the shadows, pulling strings most couldn't see. The man in the cockpit was the key to it all, a whistleblower whose very existence jeopardized those secrets. "Do you think he'll talk?" Paul asked, his voice low. Melania turned to him, her expression unreadable. "If he doesn't, they'll make sure he disappears. And if he does, they'll make sure he's silenced anyway." Paul's stomach churned at the implications. "So what now?" Melania took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the scene. "We keep the pressure on. They operate in secrecy because they rely on fear and silence. The moment the public gets wind of this, their power starts to crumble." Nearby, Special Agent Costello broke away from the huddle, his face set in a mask of forced calm. He approached Melania and Paul with slow, deliberate steps. "Mrs. Trump," he began, his tone measured, "I think it's time we de-escalate this situation." Melania raised an eyebrow. "De-escalate? That's an interesting choice of words, given that your operation involved hijacking my plane and threatening me." Costello didn't flinch. You misunderstand the stakes here. This isn't about you. It's about protecting national security. National security? Melania repeated, her voice laced with disdain. That's your excuse for everything, isn't it? What's really on that plane, Agent Costello? What are you so desperate to keep hidden? Costello's lips pressed into a thin line. That's classified. Of course it is, she said, her tone sharp. But let me make something clear. Your secrecy doesn't scare me. It only makes me more determined to expose the truth. Before Costello could respond, one of the police officers approached. Ma'am, we've secured the cockpit. The man inside is requesting to speak with you. Melania glanced at Paul, then back at the officer. Take me to him. Mrs. Trump, Costello interjected, his voice firm. I can't allow that. This man is a federal detainee. His access is restricted. Melania didn't break stride as she replied, You lost your authority the moment you turned this into a cover-up. If you want to stop me, go ahead. But I don't think you want to explain that to the media waiting outside. Costello's jaw tightened, but he didn't stop her. Melania and Paul followed the officer toward the jet, their steps purposeful. When they reached the cockpit, the door was open, and the man inside looked up with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He was younger than Melania had expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a gaunt face and dark eyes that betrayed exhaustion. His hands were cuffed, but he clutched a small tablet like it was his lifeline. You're Melania Trump, he said, his voice hoarse. I am, she replied. And you are. Just someone who wanted to do the right thing, he said. But I didn't realize how dangerous that would be. Melania stepped closer, her voice softening slightly. Tell me what they're hiding. The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the officers outside. If I tell you, I won't live to see tomorrow. Paul spoke up, his voice steady. You've already taken the risk by coming this far. If you tell us the truth, we can protect you. The man exhaled shakily, then nodded. The crate. It has documents, recordings, evidence of corruption at the highest levels. Politicians, CEOs, foreign operatives. They're all connected. If this gets out, it'll bring them all down. Melania's expression hardened. And that's why they're so desperate to keep it quiet. The man nodded. They'll stop at nothing to make sure it disappears. And they'll stop at nothing to make sure I disappear with it. Melania turned to Paul, her mind already racing with possibilities. We need to get this story out immediately. If the public knows, they won't be able to bury it. Paul nodded, but his eyes lingered on the man. And what about him? They'll come after him no matter what. Melania looked at the man, her gaze steady. We'll protect you, but you need to trust us. For the first time, the man's posture relaxed just slightly. He had taken the first step toward exposing the truth, but the fight was far from over. And Melania and Paul both knew that the battle ahead would test their courage and determination like never before. The truth was out, or at least it was beginning to surface. The air on the tarmac was still thick with tension, but the tide had shifted. The police presence had grown stronger, with more officers combing through the jet and interviewing the crew. The man in the cockpit, though visibly shaken, was finally beginning to feel safe. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was the key to unraveling a massive web of corruption. Melania Trump stood outside the jet, her figure illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights. She had been at the center of public storms before, but this felt different. This was bigger than her, bigger than any one person. As she surveyed the scene, she knew the battle ahead would be fierce. Powerful people wouldn't just roll over and let their secrets come to light. They would fight back with everything they had. Agent Wallace and Agent Costello stood off to the side, their earlier confidence now replaced with quiet tension. They had underestimated her resolve, her ability to adapt and act decisively, and now they were watching as the operation they'd so carefully orchestrated crumbled before their eyes. Paul Brennan joined Melania, his hands still smeared with grease from grounding the jet. His nerves were frayed, but there was a sense of relief in his posture. He had made the right choice, even if it cost him everything. Mrs. Trump, he said, breaking the silence. We've stopped them for now, but this is just the beginning. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the jet. It always is. They'll regroup, find another way to hide this. But we won't let them. The truth is out now, and once it's out, it can't be buried. Paul exhaled deeply. What happens next? Melania turned to him, her expression firm. We make sure the evidence reaches the right hands. The media, the authorities, anyone who can shine a light on what's happening here. If we don't, they'll bury it, and this will all have been for nothing. Paul looked at her, a newfound respect in his eyes. You really believe we can win this? I believe we have to try, she said simply. If we don't, who will? Nearby, the man from the cockpit was being escorted out of the plane by officers. His cuffs had been removed, and though he still looked nervous, there was a hint of relief in his expression. As he passed Melania and Paul, he paused. Thank you, he said quietly. You didn't have to do this, but you did. That means more than you know. Melania offered him a small, reassuring smile. It's not over yet, but we'll get there. The man nodded, then continued toward a waiting police vehicle, flanked by officers. Paul watched him go, then turned back to Melania. You've got guts, I'll give you that. Most people would have walked away. Melania's gaze didn't waver. Walking away was never an option. Behind them, reporters had begun gathering beyond the perimeter of the tarmac, their cameras flashing as they tried to capture the scene. The story was already spreading, and Melania knew it was only a matter of time before the full truth came to light. She turned to face the cameras, standing tall and composed. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who deserved to know the truth. Mrs. Trump, a reporter called out from the crowd. What can you tell us about what happened here tonight? Melania paused for a moment, then spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the noise. What happened here tonight is a reminder of how far some will go to keep the truth hidden. But it's also a reminder of how important it is to stand up, no matter the cost. This isn't over. The truth will come out. Her words hung in the air as the cameras captured every moment. Paul stood beside her, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. He had taken a leap of faith, and now he was part of something much bigger than himself. As the crowd buzzed with questions and speculation, Melania turned to him and said quietly, "This is just the beginning." Paul nodded. "Then let's make it count. The story of courage and truth doesn't end here. It's a fight we all share. Standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible, is what makes change happen." If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Don't forget to subscribe and follow for more powerful stories of resilience, justice, and the fight for what truly matters. Together, we can keep shining a light on the truth.